Fog creeps along the cobbled lane like a living thing, swallowing the first pale light of morning. A bell tolls once, hollow and distant. From the shadows emerges a woman, skirts heavy with dew, hair undone, her breath ragged with terror. In her arms she carries a boy of perhaps 7, his small frame trembling, not with cold, but with something older and stranger. His eyes are wide and fixed on nothing, and from his mouth pours a sound no villager of Blackthorn Hollow has ever heard. It is not English, it is not French, nor the rough Welsh spoken a county over. The syllables click and coil like wind through iron pipes, rising and breaking in rhythms that seem to warp the very air. The woman stumbles to the heavy oak doors of the village church and pounds until her fists bleed. Behind those doors, a priest awakens to the sound of a language that should not exist. And you, listening now, must ask yourself, is this merely the echo of some forgotten dialect, or the voice of something far older than mankind? To understand what happened that morning, we must step back to Britain in the year 1851. The country hums with steam engines and smokes with coal. Railways cut through farmland, carrying rumors as swiftly as freight, while the upper classes dabble in seances and spiritualist parlors. Science marches forward, yet superstition lingers in every drafty hallway and every whispering hedge. In London, the Great Exhibition dazzles crowds with machines of progress. But in the countryside, the old fears remain. Fears of fair folk, of spirits, of languages spoken before Adam named the beasts. Blackthorn Hollow, tucked deep in the rolling downs of Wiltshire, clings to these fears like moss to stone. A dozen crooked cottages cluster around a lichen-stained church, and when the wind carries the cry of a fox, the villagers bolt their shutters tight. Benjamin Harwick was born into this world of steam and superstition. His parents, Thomas and Eliza, worked long days at the nearby mill, their wages barely enough to keep a single candle burning past dusk. Eliza's pregnancy was fraught with fever dreams and a midwife the neighbors called strange. A woman who arrived without announcement and left without a trace. Benjamin entered the world silent, his first breaths a shallow whisper. For 3 long years he spoke not a word. He listened, yes, his grey eyes watching every flicker of flame, every movement of the leaves, but no sound escaped his lips. When he finally broke his silence, it was not with the sweet babble of a child, but with sharp bursts of unearthly tone, as though he were repeating something only he could hear. The villagers muttered that he was a changeling child, a creature swapped by the Fae. His parents prayed harder. The night Benjamin's voice truly unfurled remains etched in the memory of all who survived it. A storm churned the sky, clouds black as iron. The boy awoke in his narrow bed and began to speak, no, to chant. Clicks like stones against glass, vowels stretched into shimmering threads, consonants that bent in and out of harmony. The sound vibrated in the floorboards and rattled the window panes. Neighbors gathered, lanterns flickering, as the local priest tried to capture the sounds in hurried script. A traveling linguist, summoned from a nearby town, confessed defeat after mere minutes. "This is no tongue of man or beast," he whispered. The more they listened, the more the words seemed to slip from memory the moment they were heard. News reached London quickly. Scholars from the Royal Society arrived with notebooks and phonographs, eager to analyze the phenomenon. Their transcriptions revealed no recognizable grammar, no roots tied to Indo-European or any known family of speech. Yet Benjamin produced the language with flawless consistency, repeating entire passages days later without alteration. Church authorities saw something darker. Possession, they warned. A demonic mimicry sent to tempt the faithful. While scientists begged for more study, priests demanded purification. Soon the quiet hamlet became a pilgrimage site. Merchants sold crude sketches of the boy, and strangers queued for hours to hear a sound older than Babel. The strangeness deepened. Benjamin began to speak predictions, storms arriving to the minute, visitors named before their arrival. Whenever he opened his mouth, candles guttered though windows were shut, animals brayed or bolted. Some villagers claimed the very timbers of their cottages groaned in sympathy. Pamphlets and penny dreadfuls spread the legend across England, each account more fevered than the last. Dark theories took root. Folklorists murmured of the language of the first dawn, a primal speech said to predate mankind, whispered by stones and rivers before time wore its grooves. Occult scholars argued he channeled a tongue of angels, or of something that came before angels. His parents, torn between fame and fear, kept him close, yet they could not silence him for long. Each enforced pause left the boy pale and shaking, as though the words themselves were his breath. The church at last demanded an exorcism. On a night of shrieking wind and hammering rain, priests gathered in the candlelit nave, voices rising against the storm. Benjamin stood at the altar, eyes half closed, and began a final chant. The language rolled like thunder inside the stone walls. One witness swore the sound carried a prophecy, though no one could later recall the words. Then every candle died at once. Darkness swallowed the church. When light returned, Benjamin lay unconscious, a thin trickle of blood on his lip. He awoke hours later silent, the strange words forever gone. Scholars discovered their notes had been smudged by inexplicable damp, phonograph cylinders cracked beyond use. Within a year, the Harwick family vanished from census records, their cottage abandoned and stripped bare. Some whispered of government interference, others of secret societies eager to claim the boy for themselves. Today, fragments of the mystery remain. A handful of torn pages in the Royal Society archives, a faded pamphlet in a private collection, and the echo of a language no one can name. Modern linguists debate whether Benjamin stumbled upon a lost proto-tongue, while paranormal researchers speak of ultra-terrestrial contact. Perhaps the greatest truth lies not in dusty records, but in our own unease. We fear what we cannot name, and so we return, again and again, to that fog-drenched morning in Blackthorn Hollow, listening for a child's voice that should never have been heard. Was Benjamin Harwick a prodigy, a prophet, or living proof that some languages were never meant for human ears? Steam hissed from the iron throat of a locomotive as it thundered past the outskirts of London, a long ribbon of smoke trailing behind like a black comet. The year was 1851, and Britain pulsed with the restless heart of the Industrial Revolution. Coal fires burned day and night, painting the horizon in shades of ash and ember. To the wealthy, it was an age of dazzling progress. Telegraphs that could whisper across continents, steam engines that shrank the miles between cities, and exhibitions where glass palaces gleamed with marvels of engineering. But beneath that glitter ran an undercurrent of unease. Progress had arrived too fast for many to trust. Old beliefs clung stubbornly to the countryside, where villagers still crossed themselves at the sight of a comet and left offerings at ancient stones. Church bells rang in warning as often as in celebration, and every sudden illness or failed crop could be blamed on spirits no microscope could catch. Spiritualism, seances, table rapping, whispered messages from the dead, spread like wildfire through drawing rooms and taverns alike. The newspapers covered each supposed miracle with a mix of skepticism and excitement, feeding a nation that wanted to believe the invisible was real. In the rolling hills of Wiltshire, far from the iron arteries of the new railways, lay Blackthorn Hollow. No railway reached it. Only a narrow, rutted lane wound through fields of wild heather to a cluster of cottages older than memory. The air there always smelled faintly of damp earth and smoke, and when the wind shifted you could hear the hollow moan of the downs like a voice beneath the soil. The villagers, barely 100 souls, worked the land or the small mill by the river. They lived by the rhythm of the seasons and the tolling of the church bell, and they trusted those rhythms more than the loud promises of industry. Here, folklore wasn't entertainment. It was instruction. Mothers still whispered of the white lady who lured travelers from the path, and fathers warned children never to whistle after dark for fear of calling something back. In winter, when snow pressed against the crooked roofs and the nights stretched long, stories of fairies, changelings, and speaking stones were as common as bread. Even the local priest, Father Hewitt, though loyal to the Church of England, carried a sprig of rowan in his pocket, just in case. Blackthorn Hollow seemed untouched by the Great Exhibition or the steam engines screaming through London. Yet that isolation was a double-edged sword. It preserved the old ways, but it also magnified every strange occurrence. A single unexplained sound in the night could ripple through the cottages like fire through dry grass. And so, when a boy named Benjamin Harwick began to mutter sounds that belonged to no known tongue, the village was primed to believe it meant something more, something that threatened the fragile boundary between their world and the one they feared lay just beyond sight. Thomas Harwick rose before dawn every day, his back already aching from years spent at the mill's grinding wheels. He was a quiet man, the kind whose strength lived in silence rather than speech. His wife, Eliza, matched his steadiness with a quiet resolve of her own, though the lines around her eyes spoke of nights spent worrying over the next meal or the rent owed to the mill owner. Their cottage sat at the edge of Blackthorn Hollow, half hidden by a thicket of hawthorn that the neighbors claimed had stood since the Druids. Smoke from their hearth curled into the morning air, carrying the scent of peat and the faint sweetness of drying herbs. Eliza's pregnancy had been anything but ordinary. Through the long months she drifted in and out of vivid fevers, waking with memories of dreams she could not explain, dreams of endless stone corridors and voices that echoed without words. Villagers whispered that she had been visited by something not entirely of this world, and when the old midwife arrived unannounced on the night of Benjamin's birth, those whispers deepened. No one had sent for the woman. She wore a shawl the color of storm clouds and carried a satchel of herbs whose names no one recognized. Some claimed she never opened the door to enter but simply appeared at the bedside. By morning she was gone, leaving only a faint smell of crushed nettles and iron. Benjamin entered the world without a cry. He breathed, yes, slow, deliberate breaths, but not a single wail marked his arrival. The silence unsettled the midwife and chilled Thomas to the bone. They waited for the familiar newborn squall, but only the crackle of the fire answered. When at last he opened his eyes, they were a grey so pale they seemed almost luminous in the candlelight, a color that made Eliza clutch him tighter as if he might slip away. The boy grew healthy enough in body, yet his silence lingered. Year after year passed without a word. Other children in the village learned to speak, to laugh, to shout across the fields, while Benjamin merely watched, his gaze following the movement of leaves or the flicker of flames as though they held a secret language only he could hear. Thomas would sometimes catch him tilting his head, listening to the empty air, and feel a prickle of unease crawl along his spine. Then, without warning, the silence broke. One spring evening, as twilight painted the downs in bruised purple, Benjamin emitted a sound, sharp, quick, almost like the crack of flint. It was not a child's first word, not even a recognizable syllable. It was something else. A single note that hung in the air longer than it should have, a resonance that made the windows vibrate. Over the weeks that followed, more sounds came. Low rolling tones, sudden clicks, a cadence that carried a strange internal rhythm. Eliza tried to mimic them, hoping to coax a familiar word, but Benjamin only smiled faintly, as if she had missed the meaning entirely. The neighbors began to talk. They spoke in low voices of a changeling child, a creature left by fairies or spirits when the real baby was stolen away. The old women crossed themselves when he passed, and the men, though less willing to speak of superstitions, watched him with wary eyes. Children avoided him in the lanes, frightened by the eerie music of his unearthly sounds. Even Father Hewitt, who prided himself on reason, found excuses to shorten his visits. Thomas tried to dismiss it all, telling himself that his boy was merely late to speech, perhaps gifted in some strange way. But at night, when Benjamin sat by the hearth, tracing invisible shapes in the air and humming those alien tones, Thomas would feel the hair on his arms rise as though some unseen presence had entered the room. In the quiet of their cottage, the Harwick family lived with a growing certainty that their son was touched by something far beyond their understanding, a certainty they could not admit aloud, even to each other. The storm rolled in without warning, a bruised wall of cloud that swallowed the moon and set the hedgerows to shivering. Rain lashed the thatched roofs of Blackthorn Hollow, and the river beside the mill rose in a sudden hissing surge. Inside the Harwick cottage, the hearth fire snapped and guttered as if a great breath had drawn near. Benjamin sat upright in his small bed, eyes wide and luminous in the flicker of lightning. At first, it was only a low vibration. A hum so deep, Thomas thought it might be the rumble of distant thunder. But the sound did not fade. It built in steady pulses until the very floorboards trembled. From Benjamin's mouth came a string of syllables no human throat should have been able to form. Clicks like pebbles striking glass. Vowels drawn into shimmering arcs. Consonants that slid against each other in impossible harmonies. The tones bent and folded back on themselves, creating echoes that seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, the earth beneath the cottage. Eliza clutched her shawl tighter, heart pounding. She had heard her son's strange sounds before, but never like this. Never with such force. Thomas lit a lantern and crossed the room, but Benjamin's gaze was fixed on some invisible horizon, his pupils huge and dark. The words, or were they words, poured out faster, weaving patterns no ear could hold. It was as though the boy were reciting a story older than the storm itself, a tale that had waited centuries for a human tongue. The neighbors heard it too. Lanterns bobbed through the rain as curious faces appeared at the window, drawn by the unearthly cadence. One woman later swore the sound made her teeth ache, as if the very air were vibrating inside her skull. Father Hewitt arrived, breathless and soaked, clutching his Bible. He stepped into the cottage, froze, and crossed himself without a word. "In nomine Patris," he began, but his voice faltered when Benjamin's chant rose higher, slicing through the priest's Latin like a blade through cloth. Among the crowd that gathered was a traveling linguist named Jonathan Wren, who happened to be lodging at the mill on his way to Bristol. He pulled a small notebook from his coat and began frantically sketching phonetic symbols, his hands shaking with a mixture of excitement and dread. Later, he would confess to Thomas that he recognized no structure, no grammar, no echo of any language known to man. "It is pure sound," he whispered, "yet it carries meaning. I can feel it." Benjamin never paused for breath. The rhythm shifted from staccato clicks to long, mournful tones that seemed to warp the storm outside. The wind itself answered, rising and falling in eerie synchronization. Lightning flashed through the narrow window, illuminating the boy's face, serene, almost radiant, as though he were both speaker and listener, conduit and source. When at last the final note faded, the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm. The neighbors backed away, some muttering prayers, others too stunned to speak. Father Hewitt closed his Bible without finishing a single verse. Jonathan Wren stared at his sodden pages, ink smeared and running, as if the language refused to be captured. Benjamin blinked once, slow and deliberate, and lay back on his pillow. His breathing was calm even, as though nothing had happened at all. Outside, the rain eased to a gentle drizzle and the wind stilled. But the sound of those impossible words lingered in every mind present, a resonance no one could explain. A melody that seemed to retreat not into memory, but into some deeper place where memory itself could not reach. By the following week, the quiet lanes of Blackthorn Hollow were no longer quiet. Word of the boy's impossible speech had traveled faster than any train could carry it, borne on the lips of travelers and the fevered pages of broadsheets. At first came the curious, farmers from neighboring villages, peddlers hoping to glimpse a wonder. But soon the visitors wore finer coats and sterner expressions, men of science from London, their trunks packed with notebooks, brass instruments, and the certainty that every mystery could be measured. Foremost among them was Dr. Alistair Greaves, a respected member of the Royal Society who arrived in a cloud of carriage dust and authority. He brought with him a pair of assistants and a phonograph newly imported from America, a device of spinning cylinders and delicate needles. To Greaves, the boy was not a miracle but an opportunity, a living puzzle that might reveal a lost tongue or prove some bold theory of human origin. He set up his apparatus in the Harwick cottage, brass horn gleaming in the firelight, and asked Benjamin to speak, "Whatever comes naturally, my lad." Benjamin obliged without hesitation. The strange syllables poured forth, precise as ever, clicking and bending in their eerie cadence. Greaves's assistant stared wide-eyed as the phonograph needles scratched across the wax, capturing vibrations that felt more like earthquakes than speech. When the session ended, Greaves played the recording back, only to find the cylinder blank. No sound, no echo, nothing but a faint hiss like wind across stone. He replaced the wax, recalibrated the machine, and tried again. The same emptiness greeted him each time, as though the language refused to be trapped by human invention. While the scientists pressed forward, the church bristled. Father Hewitt, who had witnessed the first storm-lit utterance, warned his bishop that the boy's tongue was unnatural, perhaps infernal. Within days, a delegation from Salisbury arrived, 2 priests carrying crucifixes and the sharp scent of holy oil. They argued that the child might be possessed, that every unrecorded syllable risked inviting something darker into the world. "If this is the speech of angels," one intoned, "then let us hear it translated into the word of God. If it cannot be translated, we must ask why." The Harwicks stood torn between these forces, scholars with their instruments, clergy with their scripture, while neighbors crowded the lane for a glimpse of the miracle boy. Some knelt as Benjamin passed, hoping for a blessing. Others spat to ward off evil. A pair of London pamphleteers offered Thomas a tidy sum for exclusive rights to the story. Eliza turned them away with a glare sharp enough to cut. Night after night, Benjamin continued to speak, sometimes in his sleep, sometimes while staring into the hearth as though reading words in the flames. Each time the house trembled with the resonance of his voice, and each time the phonograph captured nothing but silence. Greaves grew pale with frustration. The priests grew louder in their warnings. "The boy is a conduit," Father Hewitt said at last, "but for what?" Outside, the crowd swelled. Pilgrims brought candles and petitions. Merchants sold crude woodcuts of Benjamin for a penny apiece. The once quiet hamlet felt on the brink of something it could not name, caught between the cold certainty of science and the burning fear of damnation, while the boy at the center of it all simply kept speaking, his voice a bridge to a place neither camp could claim. Benjamin's voice no longer needed an audience to draw a crowd. By midsummer, villagers claimed they could feel his words before they heard them, a low vibration that stirred the air like the distant rumble of a coming storm. Windows rattled without wind. Chickens scattered from their coops at night for no reason anyone could name. And always, when the strange resonance passed, someone would discover that Benjamin had spoken again. It began with small predictions. One evening, as Dr. Greaves prepared another futile recording, Benjamin looked toward the shuttered window and murmured a single phrase in his unknowable tongue. A moment later, thunder cracked over the hills, though the sky had been clear. Greaves dismissed it as coincidence until, the next morning, the boy recited another sequence of sounds and calmly announced, in English for the first time anyone could remember, 3 visitors. An hour later, 3 strangers from London trudged up the muddy lane, scholars who had left the capital before dawn. From then on, the pattern repeated. A few incomprehensible syllables, followed by an event no one could have foreseen. Soon the effects became physical. Candles flickered even when shielded from drafts. Dogs howled and clawed at their leashes whenever Benjamin spoke. On one moonless night, the mill's great water wheel stopped mid-turn, though the river ran strong and unbroken. "The air changes," Eliza whispered, pressing her palms to the cottage wall as her son chanted. "It listens." The visitors multiplied. Word of prophecy and unexplained forces traveled faster than the mail. Carriages blocked the narrow lanes. Makeshift tents sprouted in the fields. Peddlers sold tin amulets etched with symbols no one understood. A troupe of pamphleteers printed sensational sheets declaring the boy a herald of the final age, and their lurid headlines sold out before noon. Among the faithful and the fearful, a darker curiosity thrived. Mediums arrived, hoping to harness whatever power Benjamin channeled. One woman fainted when he turned his grey eyes toward her and uttered a string of sounds that made the lantern glass tremble. "He named me," she gasped afterward, though she never revealed what name he used. The Royal Society men tried again and again to document the phenomenon, setting up elaborate arrays of tuning forks and vibration sensors. Every attempt failed. Instruments went dead when Benjamin began to speak, springs unwound, needles stuck fast. "It is as if the air itself refuses to betray him," Dr. Greaves admitted, his voice raw from sleepless nights. Blackthorn Hollow split in two. Some villagers treated Benjamin as a saint, leaving small offerings, bread, coins, sprigs of lavender, on the Harwick's doorstep. Others crossed themselves when they passed and whispered of demons that walk in daylight. Father Hewitt preached fiery sermons about temptation, warning that miracles without God are invitations to ruin. Still the people came, more each day, their faces lit by a hunger for wonder or fear or both. Through it all, Benjamin remained strangely serene. He never sought a stage, never demanded attention. He simply spoke when the words came, each phrase carrying the weight of a storm. And whether they loved him or dreaded him, those who heard could not deny the truth that settled in their bones. The boy's voice was not merely sound. It was an event, a force that bent the world around it, leaving behind a silence thick with questions no science or scripture could yet answer. By late autumn, the story of Benjamin Harwick had outgrown Blackthorn Hollow. Scholars and skeptics alike arrived from Edinburgh, Paris, even Boston, their journeys driven less by curiosity than by a quiet, urgent dread. Each carried theories, and each left unsettled. What began as murmured speculation now hardened into darker conjecture, whispered in taverns and scrawled in the margins of learned papers. Some pointed to fragments of druidic legend, scraps of parchment that spoke of a language of the first dawn, a speech older than Earth's own turning, said to be known only to the stones and the stars. In those ancient tales, the language was not merely spoken. It shaped reality. Priests of forgotten gods were said to command rivers and bend storms with syllables no mortal ear could endure. The parallels to Benjamin's uncanny storms and his power to still the mill wheel were impossible to ignore. Occultists brought their own explanations. One self-styled magus from Prague insisted the boy was a vessel for angelic tongues, the secret speech of the seraphim that burned the lips of any ordinary human. A rival mystic countered that Benjamin had pierced the veil between worlds and was channeling the cries of something pre-human, not demon, he insisted, but something that watched the demons being born. Their debates often ended in shouted Latin and the rattle of overturned chairs. For Thomas and Eliza, these arguments were a torment. Each new visitor promised understanding, yet none could ease the growing fear that their son was being consumed by whatever force animated him. Benjamin's face grew pale and thin. Dark circles hollowed his eyes. He would sometimes fall silent for days, staring into the hearth with a look of distant sorrow, only to erupt without warning into hours of relentless chanting. After each episode he trembled as though drained of life, his small body slick with sweat. The village itself began to fracture. A faction of farmers, led by the mill owner, urged the Harwicks to present the boy for baptismal exorcism, claiming his very presence soured the milk and sickened the livestock. Others, entranced by the child's quiet grace, spoke of protecting him from meddling outsiders. Lantern-lit arguments flared in the narrow lanes, and more than once fists followed words. Even the scientists, so certain at first, faltered. Dr. Greaves confessed to a colleague that he sometimes dreamed in the boy's strange cadences, dreams in which stone monoliths pulsed like living hearts. His assistants abandoned their instruments after one claimed the language whispered back to him in his own voice. Through it all, Benjamin endured, neither frightened nor proud. When asked about the meaning of his words, he only shook his head and said softly, "They are not mine to keep." And when his parents begged him to stop, to remain silent for his own strength, he simply closed his eyes and replied in English, a rarity that chilled them more than any chant. "If I do not speak, the words will speak me." The tension in Blackthorn Hollow grew dense as winter approached. Every creak of the old church timbers, every sudden gust of wind felt like a sign. The villagers sensed that something vast and ancient was pressing closer, waiting for a moment of reckoning. Whatever Benjamin carried was no longer content to be a curiosity. It demanded to be heard, and soon no power of man or heaven seemed capable of holding it back. The night of reckoning came wrapped in a storm that seemed to spring from nowhere. A raw December wind howled through Blackthorn Hollow, bending the trees until their branches scraped like claws across slate roofs. Lanterns sputtered in the lanes as rain lashed the windows. Inside St. Crispin's Church, a crowd gathered in fearful silence, villagers, scholars, and a knot of stern-faced clergy who had ridden through the storm with a singular purpose: to drive the unearthly language from the boy. Benjamin sat in the center aisle, pale beneath the flickering candlelight. His parents knelt close, fingers entwined so tightly their knuckles whitened. The priest, Father Mallory, raised a silver crucifix and began the litany of exorcism, his voice low but firm. Latin syllables rolled like stones across the flagstones. At first, Benjamin remained still, eyes half-lidded, as though listening to a distant melody. Then his lips parted and the impossible tongue poured forth. It was not speech, so much as a resonance, clicks and tremors that rattled the rafters. The sound swelled until the wooden beams seemed to hum in sympathy. Candles guttered and flared. A side door slammed open, though no wind followed. People gasped as their breath fogged in the sudden chill. Father Mallory shouted the rite louder, sweat beading his brow. But Benjamin's voice deepened, layered with harmonics no human throat should produce. The pitch bent like metal under strain, at times sounding like a chorus of many voices speaking through one small body. The boy's eyes rolled back, revealing whites that glowed in the dim light. Then came the prophecy. The words shifted, momentarily understandable, English yet older somehow, carrying the cadence of stone and river. When the last light falters, the boy intoned, the first tongue shall rise. Remember the hollow where roots meet sky. The final phrase vibrated through the church like the toll of an unseen bell. Every candle went out at once, plunging the room into a blackness so absolute it felt alive. A woman screamed. Someone dropped a lantern. Its glass shattered, but the oil did not burn. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the storm's roar outside, and the faint, lingering echo of Benjamin's impossible syllables. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the nave in a flash of blue-white fire. When vision returned, Benjamin lay crumpled on the stone floor, silent. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the eerie glow gone from his eyes. Father Mallory lowered the crucifix with trembling hands. No one spoke. The storm abated as abruptly as it had come. Rain slowed to a drizzle. The oppressive wind fell away. One by one, villagers relit the candles, their faces pale and hollow. The scholars scribbled frantic notes, even as they avoided one another's gaze, as if speaking might invite the unknown back into the room. Thomas lifted his son, astonished by how light he felt, as though something within had been drawn out and left behind. Benjamin did not wake. Outside, the village seemed unnaturally still. A lone owl called from the woods, and the echo of that call seemed to carry a fragment of the same strange cadence, a reminder that the ancient words had not vanished. They lingered in the air like the fading tremor of a struck bell, promising that this night was not an ending, but a warning. Morning came pale and brittle, as though the storm had scrubbed all color from the world. The villagers awoke to a silence so heavy it pressed against the eardrums. In the Harwick cottage, Benjamin slept without stirring, his breathing steady but faint, a thin line of warmth against the chill that seeped through the stone walls. When at last he opened his eyes, they were clear and calm. He asked for water in ordinary English, and no sound of the strange language ever left his lips again. At first, relief flooded the household. Yet unease followed quickly. The Royal Society scholars who had witnessed the exorcism were eager to document every detail. But the notes they had taken during Benjamin's trance, the careful phonetic markings, the sketches of pitch and cadence began to vanish. One linguist discovered his entire notebook had turned blank overnight, the ink leached away as if by invisible hands. Another found his pages warped and blackened, as though held over flame. Though no candle in his room had burned, weeks later, when Dr. Greaves attempted to present a formal paper in London, he was quietly advised to set the matter aside for the good of the Crown. Royal Society minutes from the period contain only a single cryptic entry. Harwick phenomenon. Discussion terminated. No follow-up appears in their archives. The Harwick family themselves faded just as mysteriously. Neighbors recalled them leaving for a relative's farm in the north, but no record of their arrival exists. By the time the next census was taken, the name Harwick had disappeared from parish rolls and mill ledgers alike. The cottage stood empty, its windows shuttered until ivy consumed it and the stones sank back into the soil. Whispers of suppression spread through the countryside. Some claimed government agents had taken Benjamin to a hidden facility, fearing his first tongue might carry secrets older than empires. Others believed a clandestine religious order spirited the family away, determined to protect, or perhaps exploit, the boy's gift. Decades later, a single unsigned letter surfaced in a provincial newspaper, hinting that Benjamin lived into quiet adulthood under a different name. His memory of the language sealed behind a veil not of this world. Even the physical traces of that winter seemed to resist permanence. St. Crispin's Church, where the exorcism unfolded, suffered a lightning strike the following year. Records of the repairs are inconsistent. Some claim the nave was rebuilt, others that it was left a ruin. Today, only a moss-covered foundation remains, and locals speak of an uncanny stillness there, a place where birds will not sing. Yet the legend never quite died. Sailors in distant ports told tales of a boy whose voice matched the rhythms of ocean currents. In scattered academic circles, forbidden copies of Greaves's partial notes were said to circulate, each generation of linguists puzzling over the impossible sounds. But as the century turned and the industrial age thundered forward, Benjamin Harwick became a rumor, lost to the clamor of factories and railways. What endures is the hollow absence. Vanished documents, missing family, a church reduced to stone bones. Those who seek the truth find only gaps, as if the event itself resists being fixed in history. And so the boy who once spoke a language older than humanity lingers as both presence and erasure, a story half remembered, half forbidden, echoing just beyond the reach of proof. More than a century and a half later, the mystery of Benjamin Harwick refuses to fade. Modern linguists, armed with digital spectrograms and sprawling databases of every known dialect, occasionally stumble across odd shards of sound, recordings from remote tribes, clicks hidden in ancient chant, that faintly resemble the syllables transcribed from memory by those few who heard the boy. None match perfectly. The cadence seems to hover outside the map of human speech, like a shadow language that brushes against ours and then slips away. Paranormal researchers chase different trails. Some link Benjamin's words to myths of a proto-human tongue, a theorized language from which all others descend, but which predates any archaeological record. Others argue the phenomenon was not linguistic at all, but something ultra-terrestrial, a communication meant less for understanding than for resonance, an attempt by something beyond time to make itself known through vibration and pitch. Their conferences hum with speculation. Was the boy a conduit, a messenger, or simply a prodigy whose gift defies every category? In Blackthorn Hollow, little remains of the world Benjamin knew. The mill is gone, replaced by silent meadows where only the river keeps its restless voice. Visitors who find the overgrown foundation of St. Crispin's speak of a curious stillness there, a hush that seems to deepen when you whisper. Some claim their recording devices pick up faint undertones, a rhythmic clicking, barely audible, when the wind is right. Skeptics dismiss it as coincidence, yet even they admit the air feels different, charged, as if listening back. Archivists occasionally unearth hints of suppression. A government memo misfiled under agricultural reports. A fragment of a Royal Society letter burned along its edges. Each piece stops short of revelation, as though an unseen hand continues to curate the past. The Harwick family's later life remains a blank ledger. No death certificates, no descendants traced. It is as if the name itself has been edited out of history. Why does the story endure? Perhaps because it strikes at something older than folklore. The fear and fascination that language itself might hold power we cannot master. We like to believe words are tools we wield. Yet Benjamin's case suggests the opposite, that words can wield us, carrying meanings too vast for a single mind to contain, and so the question lingers like the echo of an unstruck bell. Was Benjamin Harwick a child touched by genius, a prophet of forgotten ages, or living proof that some languages are not born of earth at all? We may never know. But if you stand in the quiet heart of Blackthorn Hollow at dusk, when the river's murmur folds into the dusk wind, you might catch a rhythm that doesn't belong to water or stone. A cadence without source, patient and waiting. Listen closely and decide for yourself. Was the boy's voice a miracle, a warning, or a reminder that the oldest language still speaks, whether we choose to hear it or not? The Harwick mystery might have ended with the family's quiet disappearance, but stories as potent as this rarely stay buried. More than a century and a half has passed since the winter storm over Blackthorn Hollow, yet the boy's impossible language continues to ripple through modern scholarship, folklore, and the restless imagination of anyone who hears the tale. Today, linguists, historians, and paranormal researchers return to the scattered clues like pilgrims to a hidden shrine. What they find is a puzzle made not of pieces but of absences, a pattern of erasures so deliberate that it seems almost alive. And in those absences lies a question that has only grown sharper with time. What exactly spoke through Benjamin Harwick? A cold case for the modern age. Our era has tools the Victorians could never dream of. Digital archives unlock church records once locked in musty chancery rooms. High-resolution imaging teases half-legible words from faded ink. Acoustic software can model ancient phonetics with mathematical precision. Yet when 21st century scholars probe the Harwick case, they keep striking the same wall their predecessors faced in 1851. Take the Royal Society transcripts. In the 1990s, an Oxford linguist named Dr. Mara Ellison obtained permission to re-examine the Society's sealed Harwick folder. Inside, she found only blank parchment, sheets that fluoresced under ultraviolet light but revealed no writing, as though the ink had retreated into another spectrum. It was like staring at the echo of a voice, Ellison later said. The pages hummed in my hands, as if they wanted to speak but refused. Independent researchers have scoured census documents, shipping manifests, and property deeds for any sign of the Harwicks after 1852. They find nothing. Not a tax record, not a burial notice. It is as if the entire family dissolved between heartbeats. Conspiracy theorists point to similar disappearances tied to government projects of the era, early intelligence networks that feared anything capable of stirring mass panic. Skeptics counter that families moved and changed names all the time in Victorian England. Yet even the skeptics grow quiet when confronted with the silence of the paper trail. Echoes in forgotten tongues. If the documents will not speak, perhaps the language itself might. Over the past 50 years, a handful of scholars have attempted to reconstruct Benjamin's speech from fragmentary notes and second-hand descriptions. One project, informally known as the Hollow Lexicon, began with Dr. Greaves's surviving sketches. Half a dozen phonetic symbols scrawled on a scrap of foolscap, rescued from a London bookseller's trunk. Using those symbols and the eyewitness testimony of villagers recorded decades later, the team built a tentative inventory of clicks, glottal stops, and undulating vowels. When fed into linguistic modeling software, the pattern bore no resemblance to any known language family. Not Indo-European, not Semitic, not even the Khoisan tongues famous for their clicking consonants. More startling still, computer analysis suggested that the words operated in overlapping tonal layers, almost like music. Harmonics rose and fell beyond the normal range of human speech, as though Benjamin had used his voice to play two instruments at once. It's less a language than a geometry, Dr. Ellison explained in a 2011 conference paper. A spatial architecture built from sound. Her team attempted to reproduce the tones using a synthetic vocal tract. The result triggered odd side effects. Laboratory lights flickered, recording devices malfunctioned, and several researchers reported vivid, dreamlike images, towering stones under a sky of violet fire. None of these experiences can be verified, but they echo the strange phenomena villagers described in 1851. Myth, memory, and the first tongue. While linguists chase data, mythographers find tantalizing parallels in the world's oldest stories. Celtic lore speaks of the language of the first dawn, a speech of stone and stars said to shape reality itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments about an Adamic language known only to the angels before the fall. Indigenous traditions from Australia to the American plains tell of primal songs that called the world into being. Could Benjamin's utterances be a cultural memory of something humanity once knew and lost? Some folklorists believe so. They argue that myths across continents share common symbols because they emerge from the same deep reservoir of collective memory, what psychologist Carl Jung later called the collective unconscious. From this perspective, Benjamin's voice was less a supernatural invasion than a sudden upwelling of our species' most ancient heritage, a flash of the moment when language itself was born. Others are less romantic. Paranormal investigators suggest an ultra-terrestrial source, a non-human intelligence that occasionally intersects with our world, choosing vulnerable conduits to speak truths we are not ready to hear. They point to modern cases of so-called channeling, where individuals transmit unknown languages under trance. None match the sheer physical phenomena surrounding Benjamin, but the resemblance is unsettling. Science faces the uncanny. Mainstream science remains cautious, if not dismissive. Neurologists propose that Benjamin suffered from an extreme form of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, combined with synesthesia, allowing him to generate extraordinary sounds unconsciously. Yet this theory fails to explain the shared auditory hallucinations, the storm's sudden birth and death, or the documented electrical disturbances during his chants. Physicists with an interest in acoustic resonance note that certain frequencies can induce measurable effects. Flickering flames, vibrating metal, even temporary disorientation in humans. Perhaps Benjamin's unique vocal anatomy, combined with the church's wooden architecture, created standing waves that magnified these effects. But how does a 6-year-old discover such frequencies unaided? And why would that talent vanish completely after one fateful night? The question hangs like the low note of a cathedral organ, impossible to ignore. Whether viewed through the lens of neuroscience, acoustics, or folklore, the Harwick case remains stubbornly singular. It is a data point that refuses to fit the curve. Personal pilgrimages. For some, the mystery is more than academic. Pilgrims still trek to the overgrown ruins of St. Crispin's, guided by GPS coordinates shared on obscure forums. They report an uncanny hush in the clearing where the church once stood. Birds fall silent, and even the wind seems to hesitate. Some leave offerings, stones inscribed with symbols, candles in weatherproof jars, as though honoring a saint of forgotten speech. Local residents are ambivalent. A few embrace the legend, selling small maps or carved keepsakes to visitors. Others warn travelers away, claiming the ground carries a charge you don't want to wake. One elderly farmer, whose family has tilled the surrounding fields for generations, told a journalist, "It's not haunted, it's listening. The story that refuses to die." Perhaps that is what draws us back, the sense that something is still listening. In a world mapped by satellites and measured by algorithms, we ache for the undiscovered, for proof that the universe is larger than our equations. Benjamin Harwick offers that proof not through revelation but through mystery. His silence after the storm is louder than any answer. Every few years, a new documentary or podcast resurrects the story, and each generation adds its own interpretation. To some, he is a cautionary tale about religious zeal and the danger of silencing the unknown. To others, he is a prophet whose message humanity has yet to decode. For many, he is simply a reminder that language itself, the very tool we use to cage reality, has edges we cannot see. A voice across time. Imagine the boy now, if he survived into old age under a borrowed name. Perhaps he sat by a quiet hearth in some distant county, carrying a memory he could neither share nor forget. Perhaps the language still thrummed inside him like a second heartbeat, a rhythm only he could hear. Did he ever dream in those impossible sounds? Did he wake with the taste of ancient syllables on his tongue? We will never know, but maybe that is the point. Some truths are not meant to be captured in ink or code. They arrive as a vibration in the air, a pattern in the bones, a resonance that says, "You are part of something older and vaster than you dare imagine." Benjamin's voice, whether angelic, alien, or deeply human, was that vibration. It spoke once, and once was enough. Your turn to listen. And so we arrive at the question that began this journey. What if a child could speak words no one on earth had ever heard? We have walked through the fog of 1851, stood in the silent ruins, traced the vanishing ink. We have listened to scientists, skeptics, mystics, and dreamers. None can tell us what Benjamin Harwick truly was. Perhaps the better question is not what he was, but why we keep listening. Maybe the boy reminds us that mystery itself is sacred, that the unknown is not a void to be feared, but a horizon to be honored. So now the echo passes to you. Was Benjamin a prodigy unlocking a forgotten proto-language? A prophet channeling voices beyond time? Proof that reality is wider than our senses? Or simply a frightened child caught in a storm of superstition? Whatever you believe, the words he spoke, those impossible syllables of the first dawn, still vibrate, waiting for someone brave enough to hear them. When the last light falters, the first tongue shall rise. Remember the hollow where roots meet sky.